Це Деніс Чемберлін. Він є лауреатом Пулітцерівської премії, якщо не помиляюсь, 83-го року. Він є фотожурналістом, викладачем університету штату Айова, і сьогодні він є нашим викладачем. Тому поплескаємо йому, щоб сьогодні все пішло добре.
Okay, thank you. This is going to be a hard act to follow with Paul's work that we just saw for the last hour. And I hope it wasn't 73 because I'm not that old. I was 83, and then I was part of another group in 86. But what I want to do is talk about what word people can do primarily in order to make better photographs. I worked at a newspaper, and then I spent most of my career working in, I was living in Poland and working in Europe for American magazines. And for the last 10 years, I've been teaching at a university where I'd say 98% of my students are word journalists. But the thing is, with today's world, even word people have to make photos and video. And so I don't really work too often with people who are planning to become photojournalists, but mostly I'm working with people who are hoping to be business writers or international correspondents, but they also want to be able to produce the images to go along with their stories. So what I'm going to do is just kind of talk about and show you some of the types of things that, I mean, how many people in this room plan on becoming a photojournalist? Okay. How many are primarily word or radio reporters or want to be and know that you're going to have to make images? Okay. Because I think that's the reality anymore. Actually, since I've become a professor, I think probably I've done just as much work with audio than I have images anymore. I think if I was born again, I might become an audio reporter or radio reporter, because I really like radio documentary, because I can use it to communicate people's stories that I couldn't do through images, and I find that really exciting. And so like the last 4 or 5 years, that's primarily what I've been doing. And then I make photos to illustrate the words that the people talk about. Some of the things, though, that I think you need to keep in mind is it's about the information. Yeah, if we're photographers, we really like to make an image that's got great composition, wonderful light, beautiful impact, emotion, etc. But it's really about the information, because if the information is misleading, everything else falls by the wayside. So visual impact is something that I think is important, and it's not the kind of thing that I think a photographer consciously thinks about at the time they're shooting, but we're always looking for moments, especially still photography. That's the thing I really love about still photography over video. Video has its strengths, but still photography can capture moments in a way that it's fleeting in video. You need to keep in mind that you're looking for strong human interests. There needs to be a visual emphasis. The image needs to have some kind of center, something that's important, not necessarily physically in the center, but so that when the viewer looks at it, they understand more or less what's going on. They're never going to understand 100% because you can't control what people bring to an image. If it's unique, it's just like reporting. A good story is going to have a unique angle. It's going to have something that's relevant to the reader, to the viewer. And so you need to be thinking about those elements too. Emotion. Images don't do everything well. They don't do a good job of explaining. They do a great job of describing. And they do a great job at pulling at our heartstrings. You know, people read them quickly. There's really strong impact right from the start. And if you can put something in front of the viewer where you grab their attention, that's going to be great. Do you guys have any idea how many visual images you're exposed to in a typical day? There's different research out there, and this is, okay, it may not be the same in Ukraine as it is in the United States, but researchers in the States go from approximately 5,000 images a day to a low end of 2,000 images a day. And the truth is, we filter all those out, because otherwise we'd go nuts if we were trying to store the 5,000 images that we're exposed to, whether it's some pop-up ad on a website, an advertisement, a billboard. We're just completely inundated with things. And so it's human nature to tune things out. So if you're a visual journalist, you need to try to get beyond that. So you've got to find something that's going to grab people's attention. And that's why things like Moment. When you see a name under there, that means these are some of my students' work that I think they did really nice jobs with. You're looking for human interest, interaction. You know, good images can be in simple locations. You don't have to go outside of your town to make good images. But looking for that fleeting moment, nice light, composition, but of course the information has to communicate something. These are images students have made for different stories. This one here, if it wasn't for the t-shirt, you wouldn't know what's going on. You need those little moments. The guy who took this, he's a business reporter now. He never intended to be a photographer. But then he had an internship at a newspaper, and one day the photo staff was shorthanded, and so he said, well, I can make the photo, because he had a couple classes of my classes. They sent him out. The director of photography was really skeptical, you know, an intern business reporter shooting photos, and he came back with really great photos. And at the end of the summer, they offered him a job. You know, so he told me later he was really glad that he took the time to learn how to use his camera. I think the thing, though, that has drawn me to photography as much as anything is that you can't always control things. And I could never be a studio photographer, but you just put yourself in the situations, you hear about something that's taking place. This was part for a series that I did. I traveled around for a month with a reporter. We were covering militants and Aryan Nation people in the American West, and it was a really interesting month to spend time with the Ku Klux Klan and people who were explaining why they were killing cops because they were part of the government and the government was bad. You know, and if you listen as a journalist, they think you're on their side sometimes. But, you know, we just sit there. It kind of made me question sometimes the world I was living in. Boring assignments. Some of the most boring things you could do are the little stories in your community, but they don't have to result in boring photographs. This was the opening of a new park, and that happened to be the director of the park who was presented with a painting of the mountainside to hang in his office wall. And after all the tables were folded up, after all the wine glasses were packed away, he was still talking with people and carrying this painting around on his shoulder. So I just kind of followed him, and the light went down, and it was interesting. Got something in common with Paul is I do not like shooting sports either. And there was a time when all my equipment was stolen, so I was working at a newspaper covering basketball and football with a 50mm lens, which really limits what you can do. You need something longer than 500 to shoot football. And so I was lucky, though, because we'd go out and cover a NFL game, and two guys would be doing the hard action, and then I would be signed to the sidelines and the feature stuff and stuff like that. Made it easy for me. But I think another great thing, there are good stories and good photo possibilities all around us. And it's a matter of just kind of being open to them and listening. At one point when I was working at a newspaper, the worst assignment that you could be given, besides Pet of the Week, which is you go out and take a picture of a dog or a cat who needs to be adopted, which is absolutely the bottom of the ladder on for me, but the society assignments. And I realized that the really rich people in Denver, Colorado, who were bankers, and they were millionaires, they were living in a different world than I was. And I had a few of these assignments, you know, I would be out there, the competing newspaper would be out there along with the local TV stations. We'd have these movie stars, TV stars, you know, incredibly rich people. But there was something interesting about it that I started spending more time. I actually asked for some of those assignments, and I bought a tuxedo, and I kind of walked into that world for about 6 months. And so I spent 6 months, and then next thing you know, I'm being invited to all these mansions around town because everybody thought I was a nice young man. They didn't know the truth. And so I had a really interesting time shooting their life, and the fact that I dressed properly and my hair was the right length and I was clean shaven, it was like I could immediately just come into their world. I wasn't equal. I think they treated me as a servant, but it allowed me to see a different aspect of life in the town where I was living, because most of the time we were doing stories that tended to be the people who were in trouble, and this was an opportunity to see the other side of the community. Cameras. Ideally, actually there is no ideal camera. I mean, a camera like a digital SLR or a full-frame camera is what I would have all the time. But the truth is, we don't all own a camera that gives us the full control over the lenses that a camera actually is. That one's not a full even, but like a Canon 5D. Some of the high-end digital SLRs gives us a lot of control, the same kind of control we used to have with film. Like a point and shoot, like up in the upper right-hand corner, it has a much smaller chip. It's a lot more limited in what it can do, but it still has a lot of possibilities, and so do smartphones. And for the last couple months, I gave myself an assignment to only shoot with my smartphone for 2 months. And I thought it was going to be really difficult. I put my Leicas away in the bag, and I just pulled out my iPhone, and next thing I knew, I didn't really want to pull the other cameras out anymore, because this thing was always in my pocket. It was always ready. And actually, for a lot of the situations, it was the best tool. Now, it wasn't the ideal tool, but I figured out in 2 months what it couldn't do, and I figured out what it could do. And, you know, some of you might find yourself, I actually would not hesitate. I'm going to be playing around more with this for doing video, because I saw some students when I was in Italy recently who did some work, and they did it only on their smartphone. They did a really nice video. The audio was good, the images were good, but they were really careful how they used it, and they used it in the proper light. And I just think that, you know, with tools like that now, we have a lot of possibility. We don't all have to go out and spend $5,000 on separate camera gear right now. If you're going to make a living as a photojournalist, you probably should. But if you're a journalist first and just occasional images, you should learn how to use and find out what your camera phone can do and what it can't do. It can't do this. This has too shallow of a depth of focus. The depth of field is how much sharpness there is going deep into the image. You need a real camera to do that. But it can do this, because it has a small chip, so it means that just about everything from the foreground to the background is in focus. But you really need to be careful of what's in the background, because otherwise you might have trees growing out of people's heads. You'll have poles, you know, a stop sign. You don't want that. You know, if you can blur out the background, you don't have to worry about that. It can't handle dark light. Some of you might know. I tried yesterday at lunch to use this and a normal camera to see if I could work in a dark restaurant. And I prefer a regular camera for that. It gives you a lot more ability to gather information in low light, and you can also blur out the background a little bit. You can see how the guy in the background is not nearly as much a center of attention as he is here. And you can't control, that's the way this tool it works. So you just have to keep that in mind and work around it. I shot this also with the phone and with my regular camera, and it's much closer. You know, in this kind of situation, you could possibly get by. Actually, I should have made a video of this process of making coffee. It was new to me, it was interesting, and maybe I'll do that in the future. See, with the camera, with a regular or more of what I consider a normal camera, I can't really get the foreground and the background quite as much in focus. Here, it's all in focus. And I kind of wish, I had to play around so that I didn't get the women in the background so that they were in the shadows so they weren't distracting. This one here, I can just kind of blur everything out. It doesn't matter. So I think the strengths of the phone that I realized in the last 2 months, it's almost always available, but you better make sure you got a charger handy. And if you're shooting video or panoramas, and I really love making panoramas too, it eats up the battery like crazy. So if you're gonna use this as a tool, you need to get like a spare battery that you can stick in your pocket and have a cord hooking up to it when you're not using it, just to keep it juiced up. But it works really well in nice light. And if you always have it with you, the problem is I never get to where I need to be on time because I see something along the way and then I stop for 20 minutes and I'm waiting for something to happen, and sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's like now the camera phone distracts me all the time. In the restaurant yesterday, it wasn't enough light, but these guys there was somebody who was shooting video, and so they had a small video camera with a light on it, and that gave me enough light that I could use this to shoot, because this is at night out on the street. If that other person wasn't there, I think what they were doing is they had a smartphone where they had turned on the flashlight and they were shooting video with it on with the flashlight, and so that worked to my advantage as long as I got to the right angle. I like the fact that it's invisible. I can shoot, I can hang out at places and shoot, and nobody pays attention to me because they just think I'm another person goofing around with a smartphone or making selfies or something. And also the deep depth of field, like the guy in the foreground to the people in the back, everything's in focus. It's just I have to make sure the background isn't too distracting. You know, here it's the same thing. It's just like it's with you, it's immediate, you can pull it out. You have to get used to, like every camera, is there a delay in the shutter? I find out now I'm doing bursts more often because then I don't have as much of a delay. Because every camera has a little bit different timing from the moment you hit the shutter to the time it takes the image. One thing that is kind of a problem, beside the fact that everything is in focus is good sometimes, and the fact that everything is in focus is bad sometimes. So you have to keep in mind, you really have to pay more attention to your backgrounds than ever before. But when you have haze in the background, it's going to help you, and you can keep things clean. And then the fact that get the donkeys in the background also in focus. Or this actually wasn't a phone. This was with a really small point and shoot. But it's the same thing. It's a really tiny chip. And I couldn't do this on one of my expensive cameras. There's no way I'd be able to get this focus because it's a wide angle, it's very wide lens and very tight space. And I was holding onto a tractor where it had the big piece of iron bar right at my head level. And I've run into iron bars before in the past when I was backpedaling with a camera, and it's not nice. So, you know, I had one hand holding on that bar so I wouldn't smash my head on it if the tractor stopped, and holding the camera down at ground level. And when you have really tiny little tools like that, or that camera that worked perfectly for this situation is not a camera that works well in many situations. It just works nicely when I need something wide and the light is pretty good. And then I pull it out. You know, it's weird. Sometimes I go someplace and I've got 3 little point and shoots because they each do something different. I've got one that's got a great telephoto lens, but it's terrible for everything else. Okay, if you're not an experienced shooter, this is something that's really important to keep in mind, is don't stop after the first frame. Too often people see the situation, they see, you know, they need to make a portrait of somebody, so they make the first shot, maybe they make 2 and they think they've got it. You know, maybe it identifies the person, but it's not necessarily the right shot. This was just a couple months ago. 2 photographers with a group of students, and one of the students saw this image and just thought it was a beautiful view and made that photograph and turned it in for the class assignment. I guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder sometimes, but these photos were made less than 60 seconds apart. 2 different people. This one was made with a phone. This one was made with a Canon SLR. And then in class, the next class period, about 3 or 4 days later, I tried to explain why I thought this was a stronger photograph. There are layers, there's more things happening, and you can actually see what the point of the photo is. You know, just being there and pointing your camera isn't always enough. You have to really think about it. And this photographer actually worked around, because I looked at everything they shot. And the first one was happy with that first angle, made 2 frames and walked away. This person worked it. And if experienced photographers, you know, I think do that because they've just been doing it for so long that they always work the situation. But if you're starting out, you need to keep that in mind. Just a few shots is never going to be enough. This is the main action. This is what the event was about. It was a religious procession. The bishop was there. But whenever something is taking place in the front, or everybody's paying attention to one thing, look around you and see what else is going on that you might be missing, because the former bishop, who had retired and was now living somewhere else, came back for this procession, and all the townspeople kept coming up to him and welcoming him back. That's also worth a photograph, because more and more we're doing slideshows. And it's not just one photograph that's going to fit in print, but it's actually several images that we need to produce. Again, a situation with two of my students. They were covering the opening of a new store with this famous Italian designer who designs these leather bags. And most of the pictures were pretty similar. Most of the students who shot this particular event didn't really get the designer in it at all. And one student turned this shot in, which the designer is the guy whose face you see reflected in the mirror up at the top. And another one, slightly different, but completely different photograph in many ways. But I mean, they must have been standing right next to each other at the same time. I didn't see, I wasn't watching them, but when I looked at the frames later, I could see they were next to each other quite often, and they were using the same tools, same cameras. But one was really, and this was interesting, this is a young woman who plans on being a PR, public relations professional, and she'd never picked up a camera before. But she had a really strong sense of composition, and day one, she didn't know what ISO was. She didn't know what all these buttons were. And I was like, oh no, what are we gonna do here? And within about 3 weeks, she had it down. And I'd say the majority of her photos turned out really well. I just kind of was a little sad that she didn't want to become a photojournalist. Sometimes it's a matter of coming back at a different time. Okay, 2 different photographers. This one was actually a photographer. One of the students shot this with a camera. The other one shot this with a phone. It's the same corner, street corner. And this one, the person even waited for somebody to walk into the frame down below. The light makes all the difference in the world. I think it wasn't the same day. This was the day before, this was 1 day later. But the light is different, the framing is different. This was an event, well, a news event. This is part of the group of images that were part of the Pulitzer years ago. And in the daytime, what I realized is that we were all, the media from all over the world was there. And I was really young, and I guess I was trying to work longer hours than everybody else, because I would like work till 3 o'clock in the morning. Because what happened, I don't know if it happens as much anymore, but it's like after you send your photos through the wire, back in the old days, it's like 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock deadline, and then you meet in the bar and you drink. And so I spent my nights traveling with the National Guard and the police who were patrolling this town. This town had 250,000 people lost their home with this flood that lasted a couple weeks. And I just did a series of images of the town at nighttime and just what was going on with the National Guard. And it was just, I was looking for it, and I'm still shooting this stuff in the daytime too. But I was just kind of supplementing it with more and more of the night photos, because to me, the entire town looked different at night. It was kind of eerie, but it was also kind of beautiful, which is kind of, it's a terrible thing to say, that, but sometimes tragedy looks beautiful. This is a friend of mine. She sent me these 2 images that she made. This was her first image, and then she pulled back with the zoom a little bit and realized that it was a little bit different image now. And I think she said the Post used this one, the Washington Post. They didn't use that one. And I heard a discussion. I showed it once to a group of students, and they thought it was editorializing, and that would be unfair to use an image like that. I'm not sure what the answer is. But what you need to keep in mind, besides teaching, I spend 95% of my time teaching now, or 90%. Way too little time shooting lately. And I also do some photo editing for a nonprofit. It's called the Food and Environment Reporting Network. And we work with, it's mostly a text-based news organization. And we place stories in some of the major media outlets. We underwrite stories that take a little bit more time to do, that regular media outlets don't want to pay for. They want somebody to go in and be able to do the story in a week or less. And if we have a reporter who comes up to us with a story, it might take 6 months. And so we raise money in Silicon Valley and other places where there's some people maybe with kind of progressive left-wing leanings toward the environment. And we get money from them to help fund stories like this. But part of my experience is I'm working with word people. Some of the people I work with are fantastic. They've written for the New Yorker. They've been editors of some of the major magazines in the country or in the UK. But they're word people. And a lot of the reporters are, well, the reporters are all word people, but some of them are radio reporters too. And they're using more and more, they're using their phones to make the photographs to go along with our stories. And I'm trying to get them to realize, okay, this is when you look at these images, what do you learn about these people? Are there any clues that tell you what the story might be? There's a house, okay? No, okay. Yeah, they're immigrants to the place where they're at in California. And what this actually is, it's a story about a strike with Mexican farm workers that took place 30 years ago. So it's kind of a story that's historical. So that's really difficult for photographers to illustrate something that took place 30 years ago. So of course, I had to go back through archives and look for images from the actual strike. But then the reporter talked to these people who took part in that strike. And there's photos of memorabilia in a museum. And then those are the two people she talked with. And remember when I talked about smartphones as a camera, you have to be careful about the backgrounds. It's like that guy's head has got bars going through it. That's the kind of things you really need to pay attention. And also, there's not enough information to really understand who these guys are. So I called the local newspaper out there, and I talked to one of their photographers and asked him if he could go out. Told him gave him the names of the people. And I said, okay, here's what's going on. I need some images where we kind of understand the story. I know it's a story that took place a long, long time ago. I have archive images for that. But can you put together some environmental portraits that give us a better clue? You can actually read the text. So this is kind of a point picture. That's not my first choice of photographs, to have a photograph of somebody with a plaque that has text that is important to the image. But sometimes in these images, you have to go with that. This is another that the reporter turned in. What might these women be? They're immigrants, or they're farm workers. They pick grapes. So why not ask to go out with them when they're picking grapes? You know, the reporter didn't see that. She thought it was fine. She said, but they pick grapes for a living. I said, then show that to us. Show the viewer. You know, it's pretty straightforward, but you have to think about it. You can't just, if you interview somebody, oftentimes you're interviewing them away from their job or away from what really is important about the story, because you're sitting down in a cafe or in somebody's home. So you have to come back again, or you have to follow them. That's the nice thing about being a photographer, is you always have to be on the scene. You can't make an image if you're not there in the actual environment. I think one of the interesting things about photographs is that like I said earlier, they pull at our emotions, but they don't always explain very well. You don't know exactly what's going on sometimes. And that way, the reader has to bring something to try to interpret it. Like, is this a happy photo or is it a sad photo? Happy? Okay. Yeah, the thing is, it actually was, it's a complicated thing. It was happy at this moment, but it was sad like 30 seconds earlier. And okay, remember I mentioned that you have to always be looking around and what else is going on. Don't just look at the center of attention. This was a news event where the other newspaper photographers were there, television was there, and everybody was focusing on the fire department and the police, because there had been a bad rainstorm, that one of those storms that just dumps inches, centimeters of water in half an hour. All the streets were flooded. This boy and his best friend were out playing in the street, and one of the, sewer lid, the lids in the street where you have canals underneath, had been pushed off because of the force of the water, and he was sucked down it just like in a toilet. And so the fire department was called. They were trying to get a map to see where all these under the street canals, where they led to, and they were trying to find out which drainage lake was the closest. I noticed that when I got there, everybody was focusing on the firemen who were standing around this hole, looking down. There was an ambulance there. There were a lot of people gathered around watching, and way off to the side, there were these 4 people. And so I just was watching them because their expressions, it was pretty clear that they had more at stake than anybody else. Everybody else was kind of a gawker. You know, when accidents happen, sometimes people just watch out of curiosity. But these people, I could tell something was really bothering them. So I just kept an eye on them. And at 1 minute, firemen came over to them, said something, because they just had concerned looks on their face. And then it became this mix of laughter and crying. And it turned out that was the moment when the firemen had told them they'd found the little boy alive. He had been sucked under the streets for about 2 kilometers. Tore off all his clothes. He was all bloody, but he had been pumped out into some small lake, and he must have been conscious, and he crawled to the edge of the lake and fell unconscious. And they found him lying there, and ambulance gone, but he was alive. So this was that moment, and what I think I like to see sometimes in images is this mixture of emotions, so you're not quite sure. Photos need text. It's photojournalism, and journalism, you need text to explain these things. This tension, there's something going on. This was president of a rector of a university, and there was a budget crisis. And you can't smoke inside the building, so you have to go outside to smoke. And so one of the other guys in the background was part of this negotiation. I don't know exactly all the details of what was going on in the meeting, but these guys were both important. And one of them was making some calls to somebody, and the guy who was the head of the university was not looking very happy either. You can't always control how people are going to read images. When I made this image, I had an idea of what I thought I was saying, but I didn't realize that I can't control what viewers bring to it. I do now. Some audiences, like a Polish audience, reacts a certain way. American audiences, not at all. They don't know. It depends on what your history is, what your understanding of history is, what your understanding of current events to help you interpret images. Okay, I don't know, how much more time? Okay, I'm gonna do one thing. Okay, there are certain things I said that some things the images do better than text. I gave an assignment to a class, and they had to identify an issue in our community and put together a package. So they had to do some research, write a story, but they also had to make a multimedia component to go with it. And I recommended that they try to make the multimedia component human, because some of the stories, if you're doing a story about the statistics of hunger or poverty in a community, you've got to make it real for the viewer and for the reader. And so this was how one of my students put together his story. He was trying to do a story about food insecurity, which means that people that don't have enough money to have healthy level of eating, basically. That, yes, they have a place to live, they're not homeless, but they don't have enough money, so they have to go to soup kitchens, they have to go places where they get a good meal at least once a day. So he went to a couple of these places, and guess what? People turned him away. That happens all the time. Has anybody here ever been turned away when you go out to work on a story? How many of you are students? The students, okay, somebody who's been working professionally, you get turned, doors are shut in front of you all the time. The students, if somebody shuts a door, just look for another door, or knock again, or go around the back. And this student did that. And eventually he was invited in.
This tastes so uniquely fresh and delicious. Is it the rich Florida soil, or the perfect blend of sunshine, rain, and temperature?
Stop it! She already did it, Mommy.
My name is Joshua Dobbs, and I am a school crossing guard for the city of Ames. This is my 4th year on the job. My 4th year doing as a school crossing guard for the city of Ames. Susie already had the job. I think we found it in the newspaper, and she had already been working at it for a year, and I decided I would apply for it. It's a lot of responsibility, but I have a lot of fun doing the job. Knowing that I am keeping my students safe as they cross the street every day when they go to and from school. It makes me feel more responsible.
I'm a crossing guard only in the afternoons because that's the spot I'm at, they think is the best spot for me. I have 2 of my favorite girls there every day, and so that just brings a good highlight when they come.
Our income basically came from our Social Security, our SSI and SSDI. I would earn roughly anywhere from, I'd say, 130 to 150 a week. Since our income is pretty tight and we can't always afford to get groceries to cook, I find that food at first is very beneficial for those of us who have limited incomes and can't always eat at home. To me, it means opportunities for socialization and an opportunity to get a good meal. Jobs are just very hard to come by, and not to mention that I feel that I like the job I'm in right now, and I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. Right now, I'm not aware of anything to make more money in the current situation we have. And if we make too much money, we could lose our Social Security, and I don't like the thought of that.
Tune in next time for even more amazing encounters with all.
After high school, he's at work track meets, and then after high school, I ran up the scores to the press box for a year, maybe 2 years. And then after that, we just started hanging out together a lot and went over to each other's apartments and stuff like that, and spending most of the time together, and this is what happened. We've been married for 13 years. We have a good eyesight because we both have disabilities, but they're different. And so we have a tendency to balance out each other, because he's got some of the math and reading skills that I don't quite have efficient. But I have the social skills that he doesn't have, which we keep working on his social skills. Hey, we just have a tendency to help each other when it's needed, and we love our 4 kids.
And in some respects, it probably has to do, some countries have privacy laws. And the direction some of those laws are going now, like there's the genre of street photography and the French humanists like Henri Cartier-Bresson and people like that, that actually it would be illegal now because you have to have written permission to portray people in some kind of publication ahead of time. So you got to get that written. And how can you do street photography if you stop people and get their written permission ahead of time? But on the other hand, like in the States, there's this direction where there is no privacy. And I think sometimes it gets to the point where it's ridiculous. Basically, the way I have worked most of my career, I prefer that people know what I'm doing. I don't want to be a spy. I like to be invisible, and if there are things just happening around me, like in a busy Italian piazza or something like that, but if it's something where I'm really focusing on one or two individuals, I want them to know what I'm up to. And it's a matter of maybe talking to them, not trying to hide it. Because if you're hiding it, it's almost as if you're doing something dishonest, trying to steal the images. You need to make eye contact with people. And if you, sometimes eye contact is enough and you just kind of, it's like a visual understanding, but sometimes maybe you need to explain it. Whether you have the right to actually publish it or not, I don't know what the laws are like here in the Ukraine, but I know in Italy, where I was for the last 6 months, anybody under 18, you can't publish an image of somebody made in a public place if they're under 18 without the permission of their parent or guardian in writing, which is really difficult for journalists. And I had conversations with some. Sometimes they took a chance and they broke that law because they knew. But if the family wanted to bring charges against them, they would not have been able to defend themselves. But they just figured in that particular situation it was a positive photograph and nobody would be upset.
You show us, yeah? You show us a picture of your students, and I think you are a good teacher. And what few recommendations you can give the Ukrainian students which want to be the photographer or photojournalists? Work, eat, live, and breathe with your camera. It only, number one, you have to be passionate. You have to be driven because it's not an easy job. Certain times of your life, your social life is going to have to take a back seat. Sometimes your family has to take a back seat. And if you're not willing to make those sacrifices, then you should look elsewhere. But if you are, then I say go in with full force and work. It's about ideas primarily. And so you need to, you don't sell photographs to editors as well as you can sell ideas. So what you want to do is shoot because you learn from your mistakes, or you have the possibility to learn from your mistakes. Maybe not everybody does, but it's a matter of doing it and practicing over and over and over, and not giving up when you run into walls, because there's always going to be rough spots along the way, and you've got to work past those. And then after 5-10 years, you realize, hey, I can do a lot more than I was able to do 5 years ago. And you make that progress. Maybe sometimes it's painful along the way, but I have a few students who have done that, and it's funny because if, let's say I have one student who brings an image to me, and I say, you really need to go out and reshoot that. And they'll say, but I already did it. I said, no, but it didn't come out well. You got to redo it. And it's a matter of maybe 15 minutes time to go redo it, and they won't do it. Another student will bring me an image, and I say, that is a really great photo, but I bet you could do it even better. What about, had you thought about this or that? And then they hop onto a bus or into a car and drive 3 hours and spend an entire day, and they come back with something that just leaves me speechless because it's so good. And that's the kind of student that's going to succeed. And one of the students who was like that 2 summers ago, the New York Times and the Washington Post were both fighting over her for their summer intern, because both had offered it to her, and she was, the crisis of her life was to decide, where am I going to go for the summer? But she put in so much work. I think she was a student, but she probably put in 60 hours a week doing photos. She was just obsessed. And she's now doing really interesting work in China for a news agency.
Ще хтось має питання? Так.
Доброго дня. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи потрібні для фотографій, зроблених смартфоном, якась подальша обробка? І які інструменти тоді ви порадите? Дякую.
I keep the processing down to a minimum. I do use Photoshop, but it's mostly maybe to lighten an area. It's the same thing. If I could have done it in the darkroom in the past, I didn't grow up with Photoshop. I grew up with a darkroom. And so I still treat Photoshop like a darkroom tool. So if I am not even tempted to start playing around with learning how to move things and stuff like that. It's just like I'd rather go out and shoot than sit in front of a computer. And so I've got it mainstream down to Photoshop, or I think you can do Photoshop Elements that gives you the basic controls. On my phone, I'll use some of the basic things that's just built into the photo app. I downloaded a couple apps, and it's like I didn't feel like spending the time to learn all these little things, and then the app that I did learn was discontinued with the next system update, so then I had to start another one, so I just kept back to Photoshop and keep it simple. Lightness, darkness, if the color balance is off, I'll correct it. You know, used to have to use filters when you were using film, but now you can correct it with the computer, and it's try to make it look real. And it's a slippery slope that once you lose the trust of your readers or your viewers, you may never get it back. So it's better to have an error that you don't go that far. I know it's tempting.
Маємо ще питання? Деніс, дякуємо вам. Thank you.
Okay.